This video is my relatively light-hearted little way of saying thank you to everyone who has very kindly supported and stayed with the Glass Blind Spots over the past, shall we say, unprecedented year. It's inspired by Laura Bates's unlikely claim to have infiltrated the manosphere while researching her book about men who hate women, and in particular her Alan Partridge-esque telling of the time that she left her house and bravely walked up a flight of sticky stairs into the actual real world of actual real advocates for men's human rights. Here's a little amuse-bouche just to get this party started. As you are about to witness, this infiltration exercise, my humble Christmas gift to you, involved a great deal of pain and personal sacrifice on my part, so extreme viewer discretion is advised. This film contains footage of political activists promoting contradictory, chauvinistic, disingenuous and rather radical views, and I would advise anyone who believes that equality of opportunity is better for everyone that it may be better just to look away now. I guess this is also a companion piece or coda to the series of videos where I take the time to actually talk to some of the people that Laura Bates only talks about in her recent book all about hatred and men. And if you've seen my interview with one of her old college mates, then you'll know that Laura isn't especially open to talking to anyone about her time in the so-called manosphere, unless of course they're prepared to unreservedly praise her for writing such a well-researched and important book. Even so, my initial efforts to infiltrate the Feministasphere did involve attempting to directly contact the elusive Laura Bates. Given her obvious interest in the so-called manosphere, I initially reached out to her via her publishers and inquired if she might not be interested in some hidden camera footage that I happen to possess, involving a high-profile activist and campaigner for men's human rights. Hidden camera footage that, from a certain perspective, could be ideologically interpreted as said high-profile men's rights activist openly discussing a domestic terrorist plot. Indeed, when it comes to Laura's perception that the sort of people she sat beside at a men's rights conference are the same sort of people who go on to murder and commit mass atrocities, I'd go as far as to suggest that the footage I offered to send her lends more credibility to such an outrageous claim than anything in her entire actual book. But don't take my word for it. Why not judge for yourself?
You're not recording this, right?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay. The plan was that we were going to reinstate the patriarchy, and one of the actual sort of Allison tried to cross the border. She was bringing the prototype shark in a trailer. Okay, and she was bringing it to this conference, and all of the speeches and the panels and all of that shit, it was just a cover for our real agenda. Our real agenda was to literally just do the shark with the laser on their forehead thing. We're gonna create a fleet, mind you. Not just
I knew it.
Not just a few, but a fleet of cybernetic, super intelligent, amphibious sharks.
Manly sharks.
Yeah. What sharks aren't manly? I just gotta ask you that.
So anyway, I figured that if Laura was open to a conversation about our dear leader's plot to reinstate the patriarchy with an army of cybernetic, super-intelligent, amphibious sharks with lasers attached to their foreheads, then it should prove easy enough to steer the conversation towards some of her more outlandish claims. Outlandish claims such as the possibility that the schoolboys that she travels around the country talking to have a 0.0002% chance of experiencing a false rape allegation in their lifetime, and consequently all their mothers have to do to protect them is teach them not to rape. Disappointingly though, I never did hear back from Laura, so eventually I moved on to plan B, which was to try and talk directly to her at one of the events around the country where she was flogging her 20-pound thesis about gender terrorists radicalising our nation's youth. And as it turns out, one of the upsides of suddenly finding oneself living under virtual house arrest for most of the year has been that pretty much everything's done remotely these days, and so, unlike Laura, my plot to infiltrate the Feministasphere didn't even require me to leave the comfort of my home. Essentially, the plan was that I would attend the annual conference of the so-called Women's Equality Party, or WEEP, where Laura was the keynote speaker, and then during the question and answer bit at the end, I'd simply put my hand up and ask her something along the lines of, Laura, given that statistically speaking, you have a 0.0004% chance of being murdered by a partner or ex-partner in your lifetime, don't you think you should tone down the rhetoric about domestic gender terrorism, especially when going into schools and talking to impressionable young minds? But then, of course, it occurred to me that the chances that someone like Laura Bates would actually have agreed to take unscripted questions from a virtual room full of actual feminists seemed highly unlikely indeed. And besides, her keynote speech turned out to have been rather unreasonably scheduled for roughly 2 glasses past wine o'clock on a Saturday night, and frankly, trading the pleasures of movie nights with Mrs. Blindspot simply to witness the insane ramblings of a man-hating huckster just wasn't something I was prepared to do. Happily, however, it turned out that later the same night, and for the cut price cost of $5, I could let what's left of my hair down with conference delegates at their feminist comedy night. And so I set the controls of my laptop to Infiltrate, went about my evening, and here's a sneak peek of the hilarity that awaited me the following day.
Listen, lockdown, can we swear? I don't know. Homeschooling can fuck right off. Of course, it is so important for your partner to feel heard. Of course it is. In any relationship, it's so important for your partner to feel heard. And I want him to feel heard, but not by me.
In the corner of the paper was an ass. Excuse me while I just explain to you what I mean. It was an ass. Like this. There were flowers coming out of this ass. All right.
I was in Aldi. Aldi. I was in Aldi. I was sort of like buying 6 bottles of tequila, 5 paellas, and 3 sombreros. And I thought to myself, Hispanic buying. That is not my job. I have honestly never been in an Aldi in my life.
Hey, Tim.
Believe it or not, I have actually harboured ambitions to attend a Women's Equality Party comedy night for quite some time now, since 2016 in fact. And ever since I witnessed self-identifying comedian and not quite YouTube sensation Kate Smurthwaite parading about on stage in her underwear, wearing, and I kid you not, a large, black, and extremely erect strap-on dildo. The same year that Smurthwaite brought that particular horror show to the Edinburgh Fringe, she was also one of the acts at Weep's first ever Christmas comedy fundraiser. And since then, I've always wondered what sort of thing goes on behind closed doors in the name of equality for all. Anywho, before I get into a proper analysis of my experience, and especially for the benefit of any self-identifying feminists who might have stumbled across this, I thought I should say a couple of things about what you're about to see. As I've mentioned, my initial intention had been to attempt a parody of Laura Bates's rather paranoid and mildly homophobic account of the time she bought a ticket and attended a public event about how inequality hurts men too. But then again, that account is probably beyond parody, and as it happens, my exercise in infiltration ended up taking something of a ponderous turn. And so, in the true spirit of Christmas, let me say that you're all very welcome, and I hope that by the end of this comedy review show, we might even find some common ground. From a professional perspective, I should say that I do have a great deal of respect for all of the presenters and comedians featured in this analysis. They all make a living doing something that I would never dare to do, which is to stand on a stage and attempt to make a large room of people laugh out loud. And while collectively they may have struggled to especially tickle my funny bone, in all fairness, I'm not really their target audience, and so my main criticisms are reserved for their particularly person-is-political style of politics, and support for a party prepared to give a headline platform to someone who entirely unironically portrays people like me as domestic terrorists, for the primary purpose of further feathering their own already well-feathered nests. Because, in all fairness, if people who think a little bit like Laura Bates were to witness a male equality champion prancing around a stage wearing nothing but a prosthetic set of black women's genitalia, then I suspect there would be accusations of cultural appropriation, to say the very least. And conscious that such matters do often involve double standards and depressingly disingenuous drama, like Laura before me, I ventured into unfamiliar territory in full anticipation of witnessing prima facie evidence of hatred aimed at certain types of people from certain types of protected groups. Like Laura before me, I actually came away empty-handed, which I must admit did somewhat surprise me because, in my experience, feminists are very often to openly say the sort of things that Laura appears to think that people like me only really say behind closed doors. Indeed, in her own book, she extends a rather graphic metaphor, inferring the view that people like me need to be entirely eradicated from this earth. And, for example, the evening's headline entertainment and BAFTA-nominated BBC regular certainly can come across as a tad man-hatey at times.
You're a feminist and a man. Wow, what a world. Should you punch yourself in the face?
Do you want me to punch myself in the face?
Not necessarily. But the other reason the school said they invited me was because I'm a feminist. You know, and I am a feminist. Of course I'm a feminist. Of course I am. I'm obviously a feminist. Who isn't? Who isn't? Who isn't? I'll talk to you afterwards. Okay, no, but sometimes when we're talking about feminism, we're talking about different things. What I mean when I say feminism is this. Number one, you believe men and women are equal. Number two, you believe that equality hasn't yet been achieved. Number three, you want to do something about that. Number four, you want to be best friends with Tilda Swinton. And number five, you despise all men. Now, that is a joke. Obviously, that one is optional.
Now, obviously, as they say in the playground, Rachel is only joking and is also a fully licensed fee-endorsed comedian, so whatever you do, kids, do not try this sort of thing at home. Because in the not-too-distant future, it's not entirely implausible that you could be charged with a hate crime just for tweaking Rachel's material, just enough to make feminists the butt of her joke.
We're running out of time, but Peter, I just want to get one final thought from you. Are there words that are used to describe men that offend you?
Not particularly, and if there are some I don't like, I certainly wouldn't want them banned, but it always goes back to that old adage, sticks and stones may break my bones, but there will always be something to offend a feminist.
Peter
Well,
Lloyd.
no, that's just obnoxious.
Peter
Sorry,
Lloyd,
you have to give me a
I
chance
think
to
we'll let you
respond to
carry on this
that. That is ridiculous. No, hang on, I won't do your show again if you don't let me respond
Go on,
to that.
Kate, have a word.
Come on, that...
Nevertheless, and unlike some people I could mention, I'm not going to point accusingly at content plucked entirely from context, manufacture outrage, or feign offence at banter that doesn't really cut that deep. And if truth be told, my evening with a quintet of so-called feminist comedians turned out to be a relatively cordial and even quite pleasant affair. Seasoned satirist and master of ceremonies Sandy Toksvik set the scene live from her, and I quote, posh hotel room that she wasn't paying for. And the evening that unfolded in front of me turned out to be an extremely middle class, middle age, moderately metropolitan and mumsy affair. Aside from Sindhu V's monologue about her mother's experience of living as a woman in feudal India, there was virtually no mention of gender politics at all. Most of Rachel Paris's set did revolve around slagging off her husband, but frankly, I'm not going to fall on my fainting couch over what was essentially a less funny inversion of Les Dawson material from the 1970s. And obviously, I'm not a member of a political party that seriously wants to see chauvinism turned into a crime. From my perspective, there weren't exactly many laugh out loud moments, but Rachel Paris aside, all the other star turns were entirely enjoyable and consistently did at least bring a smile to my face. Intersectionally speaking, the lineup was an extremely diverse affair, with minority ethnic, lesbian or bisexual women and women with disabilities all present and correct on the bill. Some of them did allude to how such personal identity characteristics may have informed their lived experience, but more generally, across the evening, the banter flowed around such relatable subjects as gigging around the globe, speedy boarding passes, ski trips, completing PhDs, marrying up, hanging out at the Rio Olympics, and the problem of passive-aggressive peer group one-upmanship involving the ownership of kennel rescue cavapoos. Speaking of which, and from the perspective of a straight, white, cisgendered, and crucially middle-class male, I will now present you with my favourite bits.
Suddenly, no one's rehoming dogs. They're rescuing them. They're rescuing dogs. And someone who has rescued a dog will tell you that they have a rescue dog quicker than a vegan will tell you that they're vegan. Where the fact I rescued a dog as though it wasn't, an elderly person that passed away and you inherited a free dog. No. They talk about rescue dogs as though they personally ran into a burning building and got little cavapoo out. And this is the thing. Another thing is that they talk about rescues like they're a breed. I actually met someone that said, "Oh yeah, we've got a rescue. We're going to breed it with a poodle, and we're going to breed rescue poos." So anyway, that's one random bit of poison about lovely people who rescue dogs.
So to summarise, all in all, the night was a surprisingly civilised and at least chuckle-inducing affair, and having only had to chuck a £5 towards the cost of Sandy Toksvik's room service, I think it would be uncharitable to suggest that I was shortchanged. My main critical observation would be that the general relatability vibe for the evening lent much more towards well-heeled professional ladies who'd lunch than to zero-hour shop workers or single mothers waiting for their universal credit claim to finally kick in. Which does sum up one of my central criticisms of fourth wave feminism, being that it strikes me as much more of a career move and a collective bargaining movement for a certain class of women who are already lucky enough to enjoy lifestyles and a range of life choices, strikingly similar to the professional class of men that they insist on blaming for all of life's woes. I'd suggest that in the UK, the sort of appropriation of oppression status that I'm inferring is more about stepping over the working class and people with disabilities than it is about exploiting the ancestors of slaves. But otherwise, I do think Bill Burr's recent Saturday Night Live bit translates across the Atlantic pretty well.
Just to refresh your memory, the woke movement was supposed to be about people of color. And it was about that for about 8 seconds. And then somehow, white women swung their Gucci-booted feet over the fence of oppression and stuck themselves at the front of the line.
So in other words, these women were not the most obviously oppressed group of people I've ever had the privilege to spend time with. And phoning in some solidarity for a movement to claim that many men actively hate them is probably also pretty good for their tax-deductible bottom line. But again, and in all fairness to all involved, as it turned out, I didn't come away from the evening with a sort of Kate Smurthwaite black dildo-shaped money shot that, once witnessed, really can never be unseen. Although, as a direct consequence of spending time in their company, I did get a personal invite to Weep's Feministasphere fundraiser, and boy did that turn out to be an altogether more excruciating affair.
Have I told jokes? No. Do people think women can do that anyway? No, so why try?
If you don't know me, my name is Josie Long. I'm a stand-up comedian by day, which is the wrong time.
So this has been a joy, and I love that everyone's just declaring themselves bisexual and complimenting my teeth.
I'm a feminist, but the first Thursday after the really serious lockdown at 8 p.m, I came out onto the street and applauded my wax up.
Have I done 15 minutes? I'm so sorry. I've just got carried away talking about my coochie.
The great urge. I didn't know that I would feel that, but I started to feel the great urge for hot wax to be poured on my genitalia and ripped off at will. And there is something, to be honest with you, I know it's painful, but sometimes I like the pain of a wax. Because it makes me feel alive and it reactivates my hatred of the patriarchy. It's like a thrill. Do you know what I mean? It's just like a thrill.
And I did end up witnessing at least one thing that struck me as saying something somewhat significant and ultimately rather sad about the sort of people I was sitting next to in the virtual sense of the word.
Listen, the bar is low in 2020 and yet you didn't manage to clear it because you know what, up until now I thought you were one of the finest audiences of your generation, and you've not just let yourselves down, you've let the whole women's equality party down.
But before we get into all that, let me share some observations about the class of comedians who self-identify as feminist, with a particular emphasis on some of the Women Equality Party's featured acts.
You're too pretty to be here. You should be at home getting your back crack and sack wax. Are you sure you know what you're doing with that knife? You don't need a woman to show you.
Not being funny, but how come there's so many men here? Like, I think it's political correctness gone mad.
You know what would be really funny? If you died.
Obviously, it is frequently suggested that the term feminist comedian is something of an oxymoron, not least because feminists are not exactly renowned for having a sense of humour at the best of times. But having attended 2 comedy fundraisers, I can assure you that not only does such a marketplace branding definitely exist, but judging by the ticket prices that the second evening's host can command on tour, it can clearly be a reasonably lucrative pursuit. And when it comes to matters such as sex, sexuality and partner politics, as we know, many a true word is often spoken in jest.
Sexuality, yeah, definitely not a choice. Definitely not a choice. Why would I choose to live with a man? Why? I just haven't experienced it now. I'm just like, have you seen their feet?
And I'm going to shock you here. I was not popular with boys.
Are there any bisexuals in this little Zoom? Woo! Of course there are. What the hell? I mean, that is fine.
Got a conservatory. Things have changed. Yeah. That came with the man, though. That's not, I can't take responsibility for that.
Women are making demands. There are lists of things on Hinge profiles that you can and cannot expect from women, that you need to be ready for when you date women, that you will have to be prepared for when you date those women. And I am so, as a woman, I'm going through Hinge and Tinder and everything else being like, fucking yes, women, yes, good, get it, set down your boundaries, tell us what you want, love it. But as a prospective romantic partner, I'm still genuinely terrified.
And you can outsource most of the things that men do. Like I used to use TaskRabbit, and now I don't. But TaskRabbit was great. so I don't. the thing about Cast Rabbit is they don't split the council tax. So that's, you know. I do respect you guys a lot, but I disagree with you over your stance supporting the Nordic method, the Nordic model, and I really believe in supporting decrim and listening to sex workers. And I really hope that I can say this in a friendly, comradely way to you guys, in the hope that I might influence you in any way, shape or form to reconsider.
One distinction I suppose I should clarify is that, well, I personally don't find feminist comedy remotely funny. In my experience, at least some feminist comedians do have the ability to be incredibly funny indeed, albeit very rarely when talking about their own political beliefs.
We are graced with Sarah's presence tonight. I have to say I'm a little starstruck. I love you as Aunt Lydia on The Handmaid's Tale. Mike Pence, if you haven't seen it, you would love it. And I'm never really sure what to call Sarah Huckabee Sanders. You know, is it Sarah Sanders? Is it Sarah Huckabee Sanders? Is it Cousin Huckabee? Is it Auntie Huckabee Sanders? Like, what's Uncle Tom but for white women who disappoint other white women? Oh, I know, Aunt Coulter.
Sarah, got to ask you about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, because I don't think you've talked about it since that happened. I don't think you've been on. I know you haven't been on our show. We're so sorry that happened. It's there's no excuse for that. I mean, women should support other women, and I just wanted to get your reaction because I thought you handled it with grace and with class.
Also, given the coercively controlling, censorious cancellation culture climate that we all live in, and due to the reality that when it suits them, feminist comedians have a tendency to confuse or conflate politics with sex, I should confirm that when I say that feminist comedians aren't especially funny, clearly I'm not talking about one entire binary sex. Because obviously, and it is sad that I feel obliged to say this, women can be incredibly funny indeed. Only last night, Lisa Tarbuck's eccentric use of a perfideral cake on a rerun of Taskmaster had me in absolute stitches. The funniest person I follow on Twitter is Lisa Graves by an absolute country mile. And of course, from a feminist perspective, not even all women crack the right sort of jokes.
Hi! It's hard to listen to comedy right now, isn't it? With all these environmental disasters going on. Can you believe we're running out of diamonds? So sad. How do you even make a diamond? The only way I know how to make a diamond is to jerk off an old man. See, it sucks. Girls have to get jobs now, right? Like, we used to just, like, the women's movement ruined a permanent vacation for everybody. It used to be our dad would just give some guys some cows and some land and we could just relax. If we wanted something from our husbands, all we had to do was like twist our dimples and talk like a 3-year-old. Please, Mr. Sweetie, buy me a dress. And then if he didn't get you what you wanted, you just faint. Like, they were couches made just for fainting. The most work you'd have to do was get up out of your king-size bed, walk over to the couch, and pass out.
Equally as obviously and frustratingly for those who view everything through the prism of a never-ending binary sex war, when it comes to the competitive world of commercial stand-up comedy, men have clearly shown themselves to be by far the funniest sex. At the very least, if the measurement we're using is the annual earnings of those at the very top of their game, which, let's face it, is something that feminists do have a tendency to disproportionately fixate about. Here's a quick turn from one of my personal favourites, and bear in mind, he hasn't even cracked the top 10.
I'll be real with you, and I know nobody gives a fuck what I think anyway. I'm not for abortion. Oh, shut up, nigga. I'm not for it, but I'm not against it either. It all depends on who I get pregnant. I don't care. I'll tell you right now, I don't care what your religious beliefs are or anything. If you have a dick, you need to shut the fuck up on this one. Seriously. This is theirs. The right to choose is their unequivocal right. Not only do I believe they have the right to choose, I believe that they shouldn't have to consult anybody except for a physician about how they exercise that right. Gentlemen, that is fair. And ladies, to be fair to us, I also believe if you decide to have the baby, a man should not have to pay. That's fair. If you can kill this motherfucker, I can at least abandon him. It's my money, my choice. And if I'm wrong, then perhaps we're wrong. Just figure that shit out for yourselves.
Now, from a feminist comedian's perspective, Dave Chappelle's annual take-home is evidence of a pay gap, of patriarchy, and discrimination against women as a homogeneous group. Who knows, perhaps one day they may even be proved right. But based on all of the current available empirical evidence, I'm afraid that I, for one, am yet to be convinced, and I'm more inclined to agree with the likes of the late, great Christopher Hitchens, who point to other potential factors at play, not least the reality that, unless he has an extremely fat wallet, if a man can't make a woman laugh, then he can very quickly find himself entirely frozen out of the evolutionary game of life. And while feminist comedians will often wax lyrical about the things that women are perceived or understood to do better, the simple observation that men are more successful at comedy is a truthful transgression likely to land you in feminist jail. But frankly, facts are facts, and aside from ratings and ticket sales, various psychological studies have found that on average both sexes tend to prefer their comedy needs served up by a male.
So that's 2 egg mayonnaise, a prawn Goebbels, a Hermann Goring and 4 colded salads.
I'll leave a link to an excellent analysis by Aidan Paladin, which references quite a few and also spells out something relatively obvious to anyone who doesn't think that nature is a social construct.
Well, scholars such as Miller 2000 in an examination of sexual selection theory suggest that humor may be just one of many, many aspects that men predominantly have developed to serve as signifiers of their sexual value to women in the place of physical exemplars. Humans are actually low in sexual dimorphism compared to many other species. Consider instead the peacock, who can attract the female through a display of his plumage.
Remarkable bird, the Norwegian blue. Beautiful plumage, isn't it?
The plumage don't enter into it. It's stone dead.
Instead, women are the selectors of mates, and therefore the determiners of genetic propagation within our species. We're the ones who determine the value of mates. Sexual selection theory thereby may include all sorts of social and physical skills as methods by which men can attract women outside of just their physical bodies. These skills can include everything from intelligence, artistry, musical talent, technical ability, and fuck, now I feel like I'm describing a D&D character sheet a bit. But finally, communication skill or oratory ability, and falling under that umbrella, well, humor. In other words, it could be argued that men developed a sense of humor as a way of attracting women, as our species' sort of version of displaying plumage, at least some sort of non-physical factor of displaying plumage, of, again, as I've described before, demonstrating one's value.
Our tests in life are different. A woman's test in life is material. A man's test in life is a woman. Now, by test, I mean that those are the things that we desire. Men have nice cars, not because they like nice cars, because they know women like nice cars. That's how it goes. Because men are hunters, and the car is the bait. And a woman comes and says, ooh, nice Porsche. Gotcha, bitch.
And because women are the mate selectors, they simply don't need to engage in these same behaviors in order to attract mates. Women get to select the mates. They don't really need to attract them through anything other than being physically attractive or being physically female, really. Thus, women simply have no evolutionary reason to become comedians. While again, this doesn't preclude women from being funny, it does raise the question of why? Natasha Leggero said it fairly succinctly in that clip that I played in the outset, did she not? Women want to select the best partner to reproduce his genes. They don't want the most amount of partners. And while males seek the maximalization of partners, or at least the maximalization of spreading their genes.
All right, keep it floppy. Haul it, ball it, never call it. Girls are objects. Yeah!
Well, then it makes sense why men become comedians, why they engage in a public display of their value.
All of this presumably goes quite some way to explain why a disproportionate amount of female stand-ups seem to want to get their hands down female pants. And if you really stop to think about it, it also probably goes some way to explaining why so many female performers lean so hard into the feminist comedy brand. Because feminist comedy places much less emphasis on the art of people finding you funny than it does on the politics of finding the right sort of people behind the microphone, telling a paying audience the right sort of joke.
Well, good evening, Apollo. It's lovely to be here. I've come all the way from Brighton. Just in case you're wondering what this haircut is about. Might be a new face for some of you people. Don't panic, the BBC invited me here because they needed a beige lesbian. So I'm just here to tick some boxes. Not your box, madam, just a metaphorical box.
And is why concepts like quotas and collective bargaining can come in extremely handy in such a fiercely competitive and fickle world.
I was asked this evening not to be patronising or sexist. I thought, fair enough, let's face it, birds can't take it. You're not offended, are you? Of course not, you're thinking about shoes. Don't worry, that's postmodern misogyny. That joke was in fact steeped in irony. So don't you worry your pretty little head about it, love.
For example, when conference headliner Rachel Paris recently called out Channel 4 for booking the wrong sort of people for their end-of-year primetime quiz, the Women's Equality Party quickly weighed in, accusing Channel 4 of no less than sexist ignorance, and proposing that the producers of a commercial comedy product's primary responsibility to their audience is to encourage future generations into careers where they are represented. Inevitably, various other blue-tick comedians also cried sexism, a sentiment that, much to the embarrassment of Channel 4, soon enough received signal boosts from various yellow journalists, and had the TV special not already been filmed, presumably the makers may even have been pressured into politically correcting their lineup, and probably will have by this time next year. And by the way, 2 out of the 5 guests booked for the quiz were technically female in the binary sense of the word, but like the grid girls before them, they were the wrong sort of women, at least as far as people who think like licensed comedian Rachel Paris seem to be concerned.
Formula One abolished grid girls. You know, grid girls were models wearing kind of revealing skimpy clothes on the racetrack doing promotional activities. And after Formula One abolished them, some of these girls went on Twitter, lashed out at feminists. They said, we lost our jobs because of you. But I think it's great. It's great that Formula One did that, because in this day and age, we can no longer allow the patriarchy to tell women what to do with their bodies. It is up to less attractive women to tell
Incredibly, in the exact same tweet where they admonished Channel 4 for booking an apparently all-male lineup, the Women's Equality Party entirely unironically boasted about the fact that they had only recently hosted not 1 but 2 comedy nights with exclusively only females on the bill. indicating that much like the current mayor of Paris, this particular equality party are only really interested in enforcing quotas when they hold the door open for people who look a lot like them. And incidentally, having sat through both nights of exclusive female comedy talent, I'd politely point out that quantity and quality are not the same thing. And by way of an example, here's the grand finale of the better of the 2 nights of feminist-flavoured hilarity that I observed, featuring feminism's favourite, deadpan snarker herself.
So I'm going to end on a short song, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoy it. Not gentlemen. It's quite a long intro. I'm not kidding, it's long. Speedy border, she's on the plane before you're seated. Speedy border, she's nearly 2 minutes ahead of you. She's a speedy border, just like 100 other speedy borders. You're right behind her. There's almost no advantage to that scheme. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies. It's so lovely to be with you. I'll pass you safely back into the very capable hands of Sandy. It's lovely to be part of tonight, and I wish you all well.
Such mental gymnastics reflect a trait displayed by numerous feminist comedians, namely the ability to justify double standards as if butter wouldn't melt in their mouths.
I'm actually celebrating something tonight. I finally just slept with my high school crush. Right? Thank you. But now he expects me to go to his graduation. I know where I'm gonna be in 3 years, right? Oh, slow down. Oh, kids.
For example, they will frequently employ a comedic concept called punching up to justify all kinds of cruel rhetoric aimed at straight white men, including throwing battery acid over them. And yet, if someone like me were to make a joke about punching up someone like them, it's entirely possible they might accuse you of hate speech and even unironically call the police. And by the way, is it just me, or does Catherine Bohart send out rather confusing signals when discussing violence against women and girls? Here's her bit where she talks about visiting the dentist days after splitting up with her girlfriend and, awkwardly, co-presenter of her hit BBC podcast.
So she did, and I said, Karen, I'm really sorry, but we actually broke up. I should have said at the start before you asked me all those questions. And she didn't speak for a while, which for an Irish woman is very disconcerting. Didn't talk, and then she just went, she's due in here next week. Do you want me to stab her in the gums?
Whoa.
I know, and I had to be like, I don't think that's professional. And she was like, oh no, we're not doctors. And I know.
Stop it right now.
Well, for me, it was like, okay, you know what?
We're not doctors.
No, I know.
They use gas and air, and they use all sorts. They can knock you out. No.
I know. So I thought, okay, apart from the fact that my ex is a woman, that's such a great example of women supporting women. And I just thought feminism, we really can overcome it all.
If you've seen my analysis of self-identifying feminist comedian Kate Smurthwaite's car crash appearance on Couples Come Dine With Me, then you'll know that certain equality champions have a surprisingly old-fashioned setup behind closed doors, albeit inverted, and where they're the one who gets to put their feet up, wear the trousers, and sleep around with boys and girls.
So James, I was just wondering earlier, what do you do for a living?
Well, what I do for a living is basically I run around after Kate, doing things for her.
Okay.
I'm basically the sort of Man Friday character.
Is it like a PA role or a manager role?
He books my hotels, my accommodation, my travel. He'll pack my case up for me. He'll sort out my props, my sound. He does my marketing, my mailing list, my website, and then he does the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry.
Is that all?
I still have a tendency to think of Kate as something of a rubbish radical outlier, even in feminist circles. But when researching this video, I stumbled across a conversation involving two of tonight's star turns, which indicates that such aspirations or values are apparently very much a feminist comedian kind of thing. This came from Catherine Bohart's apparently now cancelled podcast about awkward, what makes relationships work, and involves guilty feminist podcast sensation Deborah Frances-White and her partner Tom Salinsky discussing whether or not their personal and professional relationship lives up to feminist ideals.
That's not very successful, is it? No, that's just a bad angle for everybody. I can't, darling. I can't see the comments on the big screen. This is where, okay, Tom is now going to try, well, how can I see them? Make them bigger. Yeah. No, that's not helped at all. That's made everything worse. So, he says I'm bad at tech, but actually the amount of times he comes in and makes everything worse is significant.
Oh, by the way, Tom is the chap behind the camera, and the segment you're about to listen to immediately followed the revelation that he had agreed to have an open marriage so that a certain guilty feminist can indulge herself with a bit of sapphic sex on the side.
Would you describe your relationship as feminist?
I'm not sure I know what that means.
Interesting. That's a good question.
We are both feminists. We would both, I think, obviously Deborah would, and if it needs to be said, I would absolutely wear that badge with pride.
Yeah.
So I guess it's a feminist relationship because we're both feminists, but I don't know if it necessarily exemplifies
feminism.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are some ways in which
I don't know how it could.
Does, in as much as Tom does all the cooking. And also all of the bill paying.
God, I love feminism. I love it so much.
So if we have people for dinner, what I make is cocktails and introductions.
Me too.
And Tom makes everything else. You can't have two captains of the ship. And with the podcast, Tom is responsible for a lot of the success of the podcast. People don't get what Tom does. A lot of the hardest graft is actually done by Tom, and he really cares about it.
Which is arguably, like we were saying, like one of the biggest sort of feminist moves that you could make, which is like allowing Deborah to kind of take be the face, to be the face, take the praise, take all the credit for a lot of hard work that you both do as a partnership. And obviously, Deborah, you work incredibly hard on the podcast as well. But I'd say that is a very feminist professional relationship and romantic relationship.
But it's only feminist because Deborah's the woman.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, interesting.
If our talents were the other way around...
That's so true. It's so true.
Then
You're right.
It would be the other way around. This is just the way that it works.
But it's quite feminist I guess it feels feminist insofar as what Deborah said earlier of like people don't know all the work that you do. Mm-hmm. That yes, you're right that you're the man and she's the woman, but you're not going, guys, I think you'll find so good.
It's unsung labour, the history of the world.
Yeah, yes.
Because that would make the podcast worse.
Of course. But it's still...
Yeah.
It's okay. What I'm going to say is women are trained to do emotional labour. We're trained to do labour behind the scenes. We're trained to be unsung heroes. We're trained to sit in the factories making the ammunition while men go out to glory. That's the history of the world.
Each to their own, obviously. And I guess that Deborah Frances-White's uniquely feminist perspective on sacrifice and the glory of conscripted warfare is an appropriate enough place to lead us into the conclusion of tonight's Infiltration presentation, because it involves a moment of clarity from her and a surprisingly insightful aspiration that perhaps one day we might all stop making glaring assumptions about unique individuals based only on immutable characteristics and visual clues that are entirely beyond their control. It struck me as an altogether egalitarian aspiration to aim for, and sure enough, in a room full of feminists, it went down like a lead balloon.
Oh my God, that was amazing, that gig. That was amazing. So I was in an office in North London and I had to put this big headset on. And then I went into what looked to me like a comedy club, like an anime. It was like I was in a cartoon. many of you will know how virtual reality works, but I didn't. So it was like being in an animated matrix. So I put it on, and it looked like I was standing in the wings of a comedy club, and I could see the compere. And then they said my name, and I heard everyone clapping. But they're all over the world, but they also think they're sitting in the same comedy club, that they feel like they're sitting in the seat. But some of them are in Hong Kong, some of them are in America. Absolutely amazing. And what I had done is they'd asked me, they said, do you want this avatar where you're a woman who looks a bit like you, but in jeans and a t-shirt? Or do you want the avatar where you're in a plunging gown and you look like you could be on a billboard? And I was like, obviously the fucking billboard one. Why would I not choose the sexy one? I don't understand. Why would anybody not sex up? But then when I went out onto the stage, the audience were like a robot, and a dog, and a rabbit, and a rabbit in a ruff, like an Elizabethan ruff, and a donut with arms and legs. And I was like, first I thought two things. The first was, wow, people have withdrawn from sexiness. They've gone, I'm withdrawing from the race. You can't judge me. You can't assess. You've got no information on my gender expression, my race, my age, whether I have a disability or not. You've got no information. You're just going to have to talk to me, as a rabbit in a ruff, and you're going to have to get to know the rabbit and that ruff, and that's what you've got to do. And it was super fascinating. I learned that, and the second thing I learned was there's nothing sexier than a donut with arms and legs. It was a glazed donut, and I was like, why would I have come like a 90s glamour model when I could have come as a donut? Because you just really want to put your tongue in that glazed hole. You could make love to a glazed donut. I mean, that would be the nirvana, obviously. But also, it was very difficult doing observational comedy because you're looking around the room and go, what have we all shared? Like, you had to do personalised. You had to go, oh, rabbit in a ruff. Isn't it awful when you're running late and then you fall down a hole and then you have to entertain a girl at a party with mad people? Like, you literally had to go, oh, everybody had their own. Isn't it awful when you're the last donut in the box and they've picked all the chocolate ones and you're just lying there being glazed and delightful, but nobody likes strawberry? I mean, it was literally that. It was absolutely bizarre. But I did think it taught me not to make it taught me about how many assumptions we make and how much we prejudge people. Because I realised that I could make no assumptions about a rabbit in a ruff. I had no information about who they were. I just had to get to know them. But then I realised if I went to a second comedy tomorrow night and I met another rabbit in a ruff, I would have no information about rabbits and ruffs, because this person could be a 35-year-old man from California, which I think he was. But the next rabbit in a ruff I meet might be a 14-year-old girl from India. And I was like, oh my God, we need to spend more time in the virtual world so that when we come out into the real world, we stop making assumptions about people based on what they look like. Because when I came out to the real world, I went, aren't we all a rabbit in a ruff in a way? No, that's not gone down well at all. Nobody's made that same beautiful assessment that I have. Everybody's just gone, no.
So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Equality is better for everyone, and yet this sort of level playing field and protection from prejudice created by a scenario where suddenly no one could signal their perceived pecking order status in the grand scheme of things isn't something that remotely appeals to the sort of people who think and look a little bit like Laura Bates. I wonder why on earth that might be.
Yay! Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.